What if a city could float, not just metaphorically, but literally, drifting across a lake, lifting its houses from the ground, carried by reeds and rivers, moving with the seasons, or vanishing entirely when danger approached? While modern minds imagine cities as concrete, immovable things, our ancestors across the Americas held a very different vision. Today, we're uncovering an astonishing secret: the existence of floating islands and movable cities, built not just for survival, but as profound expressions of harmony with water, migration, and spiritual cosmology. From the living reed islands of Lake Titicaca to flood-borne city rafts in the Amazon, from drifting island camps along the Mississippi to myths of entire metropolises that could lift themselves and walk away, we'll travel through myth, memory, and science to uncover how ancient America mastered mobility. These weren't mere stories. These were cities, built not to stand still, but to flow with the world around them. So settle in. Today's journey floats on history's most fluid ground. High in the Andean mountains, cradled between Peru and Bolivia, lies the massive and mysterious Lake Titicaca. At over 12,000 feet above sea level, this is the highest navigable lake on Earth and home to one of the oldest known floating civilizations, the Uros people. The Uros do not live on land. For generations, possibly millennia, they have built and maintained an entire world afloat. Using the buoyant totora reeds that grow in thick banks along the lake's edge, the Uros construct artificial islands, boats, watchtowers, and homes, all resting upon floating mats that must be carefully tended and renewed. These aren't small rafts. Some islands stretch over 50 meters and host entire families. Oral tradition says the Uros once ruled the lake. They claim they existed before the sun, before the Inca, and were descendants of a forgotten people that refused to live on land. Their floating islands weren't just protection from the elements, they were strategic. The Uros could untether their homes and move them away from war, away from invaders, away from tribute collectors. Mobility was survival. Flexibility was strength. These weren't just homes. They were a form of sovereignty. Ancient cities that drifted at will, changing the rules of conquest. To understand these marvels, we must look closer at the engineering behind them. Floating islands begin with dense layers of totora root masses, called kili, which naturally form in the lake's shallow waters. These buoyant foundations are pulled up, dried, stacked, and bundled together into platforms. Over these, the Uros add fresh reeds in crisscross layers, tied and pegged in place. The reeds must be replaced regularly, every 10 to 15 days in the rainy season, less in the dry months. In total, the islands might weigh dozens of tons, yet remain afloat. To anchor them, stones are tied with ropes and lowered to the lake bed. But when needed, those anchors can be lifted, and the entire island moved. Imagine, instead of defending a fixed city, you simply move it. Instead of resisting the tide, you ride it. The Uros built homes, watchtowers, communal spaces, and even floating gardens. Some had boats carved from reeds, shaped like dragons or pumas, symbols of protection. Each island had its own leadership, often ruled by a family elder and governed by communal law. This wasn't a primitive camp. It was a political system afloat, a society in constant motion. But how old is this tradition? That's where things get strange. Some researchers believe the floating islands go back only a few centuries, perhaps created after the Spanish arrived and displaced indigenous groups. But others suggest far deeper roots. Uros' oral histories claim they predate the Inca Empire by centuries, maybe longer, and some scholars speculate they might even be linked to Tiahuanaco, the mysterious megalithic civilization that once dominated the Lake Titicaca Basin. Tiahuanaco's fall, around 1000 CE, coincided with massive climate shifts, rising and falling waters that could have pushed survivors into more flexible forms of settlement. In this chaos, floating islands might have been born, tools of adaptation in a flooding world. There are even theories, though controversial, that the Uros culture preserves fragments of pre-flood knowledge, a legacy of ancient hydrological wisdom long buried under sediment and myth. Could the floating cities be remnants of a climate-savvy civilization whose engineering has been mistaken for legend? Now we turn to the east, to the heart of the Amazon. Here, the rivers are not gentle streams. They are living beings, rising, falling, and shifting courses dramatically with the seasons. In this lush, pulsing environment, archaeologists have uncovered signs of sophisticated societies that mastered the art of floodplain living. These people, often dismissed as jungle tribes, were builders of mounds, causeways, canals, and raised fields, systems adapted to water's moods. But there's more. Indigenous oral traditions speak of floating villages, entire settlements that would rise on wooden platforms or raft-like foundations during the wet season. Called Vasia cities, these would drift gently with the rivers, moored when needed, but capable of migration. The people harvested floating crops, tended to animals aboard the platforms, and moved their homes like aquatic caravans. These weren't myths. The Baniwa, Tikuna, and Omagua peoples all share stories of cities that moved like fish in the stream. Archaeological digs have found post holes in riverbeds, signs of stilt architecture, and strangely shaped logs, possibly remnants of ancient mobile foundations. In a land where stillness meant drowning, movement was life. Let's move north, into the fertile and unpredictable basin of the Mississippi River. Here, before European contact, the landscape was dominated by the Mississippian culture, builders of massive mound cities, including the sprawling metropolis of Cahokia, which once rivaled London in population. But beyond these monumental sites, explorers recorded something more ephemeral: floating islands. French and Spanish records from the 1600s and 1700s describe giant mats of vegetation, sometimes dozens of acres wide, drifting downriver with trees still growing on them. Indigenous groups like the Tunica, Chitimacha, and Natchez are said to have used these as seasonal hunting platforms or temporary fishing camps. In some accounts, they even built huts on them, homes that could migrate with the floods. Choctaw oral histories tell of floating worlds that vanished at dawn and sacred places that rode the rivers to safety when threatened. Even the mythic city of Etowah, another Mississippian mound site, is tied to legends of drift and departure, a city that refused to be conquered and instead flowed away with its people. Were these poetic metaphors or encoded histories of mobile life? Throughout the Americas, legends persist of cities that moved, vanished, or could never be found twice. Among the Inca, there's the legend of Paititi, a golden city hidden in the Amazon that shifts location to avoid outsiders. The Maya speak of the Itza people, whose cities walked into the jungle, disappearing when their time had passed. Among the Hopi and Zuni, sacred cities were said to follow the stars, rebuilding in new locations every few generations to maintain cosmic alignment. Even the Aztec had tales of Aztlan, the mythical floating homeland of their ancestors, depicted as an island city surrounded by waters, its location never fixed. Never fixed. Scholars often treat these as mythology, But when seen through the lens of mobility and adaptation, a different picture emerges. These weren't fantasy cities, but cities designed to move with purpose, to protect sacred knowledge, avoid conquest, or follow natural and spiritual cycles. The idea of permanence was not universal. For many ancient American cultures, motion was sacred. Not all movable cities were responses to flooding. In many traditions, cities were temporary by design, built to exist for a season, a ritual, or a migration, and then disassembled. The Great Plains tribes of North America, such as the Lakota and Cheyenne, created massive mobile camps for seasonal gatherings, complete with ceremonial centers, council lodges, and complex social hierarchies. These were not disorganized groups. They were cities made of skin, poles, and sacred geometry. Some summer councils involved thousands of people and took days to construct. Similarly, the Pueblo and ancestors of the Southwest would hold festivals that drew people from dozens of communities. Temporary trade cities sprung up in desert valleys, leaving only shards and hearths behind. Among the Hohokam and ancestral Mogollon, archaeologists have found ghost villages that seem to appear and vanish in cycles, suggesting not collapse, but intentional movement. These were ritual cities, bound to the sun, moon, and stars, meant to come and go like tides. Permanence was not power. Ephemerality was transcendence. Today, as sea levels rise and climate volatility increases, the world is looking back to old ideas. Architects and engineers are designing floating neighborhoods in the Netherlands, mobile fish farms in Southeast Asia, and artificial islands in the Pacific. But often, they overlook that ancient America already solved this. The Uros Islands are still here, living proof of sustainable aquatic urbanism. In the Amazon, indigenous groups still practice seasonal migration and water-adapted life. In Louisiana, descendants of coastal tribes are rebuilding floating houses using old bayou knowledge. And across native communities, there is a revival of memory, remembering the cities that floated, vanished, and returned again. These aren't just historical novelties. They're models for resilience in a changing world. Cities that weren't stuck, but could flow, pivot, and renew. Floating islands, movable cities, vanishing towns, ephemeral temples. All across ancient America, we find signs of a different kind of civilization, one not obsessed with permanence, but devoted to fluidity, rhythm, and renewal. These weren't lesser societies. They were masters of motion. In a world where we often equate progress with concrete and steel, the ancients remind us that flexibility is wisdom, that cities can drift, that home can follow the heart. That knowledge, when bound to nature, doesn't sink, it floats. So the next time we imagine ancient America, let's not just look to the mounds and pyramids. Let's look to the water. Let's look to the reeds. Let's listen for the songs sung over drifting fires, because the untold secrets of ancient America may be drifting still, just beyond the edge of what we thought was solid ground.